In this lesson, we will configure our web application to use one of the most common methods of authentication within Spring MVC, and that is using your own custom form for logging in. All we need to do is to have a JSP file that will serve as our form for logging in. In our example, we have login.jsp. And if we look at our home controller, this form is displayed when we hit the /login URL. Let's configure this setup within our security context.xml file. We need to remove HTTP basic, and now we're going to use the security namespace, and we're going to use the form login tag. Now, there are a number of attributes on this tag that we can set up to tweak how we use our login page for authentication. The first thing we can specify is the login page itself. And we're actually going to be using the URL here that we would like to call when we attempt to access the login page. And we're actually just going to use the default, which is /login. So that will map to our home controller, which will then display our login page. Now at this point, we are going to specify the type of request for this controller. So we're going to say that the method is equal to a GET request. So we just add a new element, which is method, to this annotation, and then we specify that it is a GET request. And that will help us distinguish between whether we are requesting to receive the login form or we are posting the login form. And that's important because the next attribute that we're going to set, the login processing URL, is the URL that will invoke our actual authentication provider and tell that authentication provider to check these credentials and to actually perform the authentication for the user. Now, this also defaults to /login, and we're just going to explicitly define that configuration for our purposes of becoming more familiar with the framework. So we're now going to save our changes to the security context.xml file. We need to take a look at our form at this point, because the next two configuration parameters we're going to set correspond with the parameter that will contain our username and our password. So here you see that we have custom_username and custom_password. So those are the names of the parameters that will be sent back with the request to identify the username and the password. If we go to our form login tag, these attributes are able to be set using the username-parameter attribute and also the password parameter attribute. These will by default be set to username and password. Since we're using custom_username and custom_password, we need to define those within our configuration. We are set up with our security configuration. Now we need to make a few changes to our login form. So I'm going to copy this URL, and we will now go into the login page. And here we see that our form does not have an action or a method. So we're going to use a post, and now we need to set up the URL that we will submit our form to. And that needs to be our login processing URL that we established within our security configuration. And I'm just going to assign that to a variable within the page. And then for the action on this form, we're going to assign it to that new variable we just created, our domain name with our context root /login. And that will cause us to submit to the login processing URL, which will then attempt to authenticate the user using username and password authentication via that DAO authentication provider. So at this point, we are going to run our application. So I'm going to navigate back to the Package Explorer and then hold Shift, Alt, hit X, and then hit R. And it will bring up the Run on Server dialog. We can hit Finish, and it will deploy our application and then eventually launch a browser window with it. I'll try to navigate to appointments, Now you'll notice we get our custom login page. This is not generated by Spring. This is something we have provided. And we'll put in username, now password. We have an issue with the CSRF token. So that's cross-site request forgery. And this is something we mentioned as a feature of Spring. So they are protecting us from cross-site request forgery, and that requires us to provide a CSRF token. So in order to do that, we need to include Spring's tag libraries for Spring Security. You can just go to Maven and look for Spring-Security taglib. And then once again, you'll pick the org.springframework.security group ID, hit OK. And once that is in place, we can go back to our login page. And now we'll need to add this taglib to the top of our JSP file. We declare it. We need to provide a URI. Once you start to provide the URI, if you just hit Control Space, you will then get some auto completion. And you can find the www.springframework.org/security/tags URI. And that's the one you'd like to use. And then just assign it a prefix. I'm going to go with SEC. All we need to do is go down to our form and add our CSRF token. There we see CSRF input. And once we put that in place, we will now restart our server, navigate back to the browser, and we'll revisit the application and attempt to log in one more time. And we'll see this time that our security configuration will be corrected, and we'll be able to authenticate using our custom form as an authentication entry point. So user, password, and there we go. We log into the application. So in this lesson, we saw how we can configure Spring Security to use a custom login form, and that allows us to keep the theming or the style of our application even on that login page that we develop. And you'll see there are other configurations that we can put in place using a custom form login.